For as long as I can remember, I have always had a special affinity for video games. Ever since I could hold a controller, actually, playing games such as Pole Position with my dad, or having a family night of Mario Party. Just Dance helped me get into shape, and Rock Band allowed me to live out my fantasy of being an actual rock star. Resident Evil opened my eyes to just how scary and dreadful it can be to play a game sometimes, and Call of Duty helped me to connect with friends over the internet in tense death matches. I remember getting frustrated over missing a jump in Crash Bandicoot, and I remember screaming at my TV as I struggled through games like Dark Souls. Mortal Kombat was always too hard for me, even now, but I still had fun smashing the buttons of my controller in hopes that I would catch my opponent off guard and end the torture I was being put through. Shooters like Doom totally jacked my adrenaline as I slaughtered demon after demon while listening to the likes of Rob Zombie or Judas Priest. Gaming has become a part of my life, as well as a part of several others out there. Games can create vast, vibrant worlds we can explore without any real consequences, and they create an escape from the craziness and the cruelty of the world we all share and walk upon. Gaming provides people a way to connect with others, to make new friends, and sometimes even new enemies. Video games, whether we like it or not, have become an iconic part of history as a whole, ever since the dawn of the arcades. And there are several impactful games out there that have stuck with a lot of people over the years. Mario Kart, Pac-Man, Borderlands, even Grand Theft Auto. But there is one game in particular that has resonated with me for years upon years at a time. It is a game that I always get excited about upon the announcement of a new release in the series. It is a game I vividly remember hand-drawing my own maps to help navigate through dungeons and find my way around the world. It is a game that has always offered me an escape, and it is a game that I will continue to cherish forever. The Legend of Zelda. Nintendo's magnum opus, so to speak, their flagship series above any others, well, besides maybe Mario. I have a lot of fond memories for this series, a lot of fun times and a lot of hours of my life gone in the blink of an eye as I sat and played without restraint, trying to beat the next dungeon, or trying to find that next cool weapon I could use, or trying to save Princess Zelda from the evil clutches of Ganon. It's all really good stuff, and I want to take some time to dive more into the history of The Legend of Zelda. I will talk of the game's initial inception, and I will explore the roots of its timeline, talking about each game a little bit and why they resonate so well with me. Strap yourselves in for a total ride of nostalgia, my friends, and lose yourself in the vast world of Hyrule as we journey about in search of its past. Since his initial video game debut in 1985, save for the Virtual Boy, Link has always worked his little elfin boots off to ignite interest in every single piece of Nintendo hardware in existence, even some of the more weirder contraptions that never left his native home of Japan. Even during a dark and bleak period of the GameCube, where seemingly infallible Nintendo IPs were somehow failing to really capture that sense of old Nintendo magic, there was at least one license that has always looked after its Nintendo seal of quality. Nearly always, I should say. And so, it is only fitting that a Zelda game would close out the GameCube's rough life, and it was also the first license that Nintendo turned their attention to as a proper launch title for its much-hyped Switch. But before the fantastical world of Hyrule, video games were usually single-screen worlds that were filled with bleeping and chirping sprites where progression and skill were distinguished by simply stamping 3 letters into a list. And before The Legend of Zelda, game narratives were generally spared a measly paragraph on the side of an arcade cabinet, or a few dubiously spelled words on a menu screen, and rules and stories would typically play out through easily digestible visuals and an ounce of common sense among the player base. Escape the ghosts in Pac-Man. Shoot the cascading nuclear bombs. Avoid the asteroids. Off the back of the unprecedented arcade success of Donkey Kong, Nintendo would be able to finance 3 brand new totally pivotal projects that would come to transform its name from a Hanafuda card manufacturer that was just dabbling a little bit in the world of electronic entertainment to a major player in that very same market pretty much overnight. The Famicom, Super Mario Bros., and of course, The Legend of Zelda. Development for The Legend of Zelda began at roughly the same time as that of Super Mario Bros., with Shigeru Miyamoto splitting his time between the divided development team and overseeing both projects simultaneously. His early intention for The Legend of Zelda was to create a sprawling virtual garden that players could explore, a video game that was set inside a lush and vibrant world that would grow and unfurl around the player as they explored it. The thinking of this, at the time, was that Super Mario Bros. Was going to offer an immediately accessible and technically unique gaming experience in stark comparison to pretty much everything else on the market at the time. And The Legend of Zelda would offer gamers the complete freedom to essentially carve out their very own adventures. Despite this particular juxtaposition of projects within the camp, Mario and Zelda would both decide to do away with the element of quick play, high score chasing, and instead replace it with the mere notion of completionism, ending the game experience and unlocking a reward screen for your efforts. It was a belief that wouldn't hold up inside the money-feeding world of popular arcade gaming, but it was one that Miyamoto believed to be perfectly viable within the sanctuary of one's own home. Miyamoto grew up in the small town of Sonobe in Kyoto, Japan, a picturesque upbringing that would offer the perfect place for his imaginative mind to wander without restraint. He was a keen artist with a strong affinity for music, architecture, and general design, passions that would ultimately lead him onto an academic path in industrial design and as a staff artist for Nintendo. But it was his fascination for pure exploration that he would try to impart to gamers through The Legend of Zelda. His inspiration behind the dungeons, which are now an iconic staple in the entire Zelda franchise, came from the many hours upon hours he would spend playing around the rooms of his childhood home, and the crystalline lakes and the bountiful greenery of Hyrule from his recollections of exploring the vast fields nearby home. Miyamoto's decision to use the name Zelda was allegedly inspired by the wife of the American author F. Scott Fitzgerald. Famously dubbed the first American flapper, it was her willful nature that Miyamoto would find to be so endearing, so alluring, and thus persuade him to use her as the muse for the titular princess. As with Donkey Kong and Super Mario Bros., Miyamoto would polarize Zelda's story around three central characters: a hero named Link, a heroine named Princess Zelda, and a villain named Ganon. Again, it would look to an unusual hero, a young elf-like boy, to embark on the epic quest. Link's involvement in the story comes after he spots an old woman being attacked and quickly decides to jump to her aid. He discovers that the woman's name is Impa and that she is a porter to the princess of Hyrule. He then hears news of the ensnared princess at the nefarious trotters of Ganon and learns of the warlord's evil intentions for the sacred artifact known as the Triforce, as well as the entirety of the land of Hyrule. Link, being the genuine dude that he is, duly agrees to seek out the 8 segments of the Triforce of Wisdom and ventures to the top of Death Mountain where the evil Ganon is waiting for him. In the first game, the Triforce is described as 3 magical triangles, capable of granting great power to their bearer, but its mythology and its origins would continue to evolve throughout the series and its progression. Essentially, the Triforce is the catalyst to everything, the object of sheer desire that brings and binds the story and the characters together seamlessly to create an epic and poetic tale of growth, strength, and courage. Inside Hyrule, there exists 3 parts to the Triforce. The Triforce of Power that Ganon acquires during his siege of Hyrule Castle, the Triforce of Wisdom, which is the part Link is seeking inside the dark, twisting dungeons that run deep beneath Hyrule, and the Triforce of Courage, which would first make its appearance in Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. First released in 1986 on the Famicom Disk System, a secondary disk drive that made use of rewritable disks, which never really found a release outside of Japan. In the West, the game came pressed on majestic gold cartridges that incorporated an internal battery facility to save game data, and it would also become the first game cartridge to do this kind of thing. Miyamoto's notion to have the game feel completely bilinear was extremely apparent with this. Dropped into a huge overhead world ultimately paved the way with little to no direction at all, meaning the player had to decipher Zelda's modus through careful consideration and natural exploration alone. A mantra that actually caused a wave of anxiety in the prolific game designer when the game was eventually released to the public. I remember that we were very nervous because The Legend of Zelda was our first game that forced players to think about what they should do next, Miyamoto once said to Superplay magazine. We were afraid gamers would become bored and stressed by the new concept. Luckily, they reacted the total opposite. It was these elements that made the game so popular, and today gamers tell us how fun the Zelda riddles are, and how happy they become when they have solved a task and proceeded with the adventure. It makes a happy producer. But Miyamoto needn't have worried at all. Graduating with honors alongside its developmental classmate Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda would go on to be successful for Nintendo, eventually grossing sales of 6 million copies. As with Donkey Kong before it, Nintendo was incredibly quick to turn out a sequel while the popularity of the game was still in its mere infancy. And a year later, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link was released. Although Miyamoto would oversee the game's initial development, its creation would fall to a new development team, one that would switch the action from overhead to a side-on perspective and bathe it in subtle Mario-esque platform undertones, a change that proved to be quite unpopular with fans of the first game. Its structure would remain generally similar to the first, however. It is another find several somethings, 9 crystals to be exact, to open something, the Great Palace, that holds something with wish-granting properties, the Triforce of Courage. And this is a structure that has been mirrored for almost every single game in the series to follow. The Adventure of Link would also introduce a few staples of the role-playing genre that would never really take off in the series. Link, for instance, could earn experience points to level up his attacks, raise his stamina, and to also obtain magic points to cast spells at enemies. Additionally, the game also introduced village sections where Link gathers information from locals wandering around the town, laying down a thick foundation for the many games that would surely follow. In 1990, a new Nintendo console, the SNES, Super Nintendo Entertainment System, was breaking into the market rapidly. An early and pivotal partnership with Capcom, securing the machine ports of both Street Fighter II and Final Fight, bolstered by an impressive debut of Super Mario Bros., would have everyone eagerly anticipating the end of Link's 4-year absence from video games. And Nintendo would certainly not disappoint. Released in 1991 and into a swath of praise, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past is cited by several fans as the seminal game in the entire Legend of Zelda franchise. Even today, people talk of this game like it's God, essentially, and it's for a pretty good reason. The first 2 Zelda games were the creations of Shigeru Miyamoto and fellow Nintendo game designer Takashi Tezuka. However, for A Link to the Past, Miyamoto would enlist the writing talents of producer Kensuke Tanabe. Link's SNES debut would make a return of the popular overhead look of the original title, as well as introducing some loving tweaks to the visuals and the basic controls. Link could now move diagonally, he could run with the aid of the enchanted Pegasus boots, and the range of his sword attack was also improved to cover a wider arc. Perhaps the most notable aspect came from the game's deft use of its items. There was the brand new hookshot, which Link could use to stun his enemies or to hoist himself across large gaps in the ground. He could use the bow, which made its initial appearance in the first game, but was used to much greater effect here, with ice and fire arrows. And there was the new magic mirror, which Link could use to shift between the light world, a colorful, vibrant, lush depiction of Hyrule, and the Dark World, a dank and nightmarish vision of Hyrule painted over with skulls, oily-looking marshlands, and menacing-looking trees. The game was packed with a dizzying array of side quests the player could embark on, as well as minor subplots and flourishes. A Link to the Past also marks the very first time in the series that the game's three main protagonists, Link, Zelda, and Ganon, are not the same incarnation seen in the previous titles. This game was set hundreds of years before the first game, as flipping the back of the original box overstates, and our heroes are predecessors to the original Link and Zelda. And this time-traveling about has become a long-running theme throughout the series because of this entire trend, which runs through the early games, seemed to be for Nintendo to release a Zelda game set in its own unique time and then follow it up with a quirky direct sequel of sorts. Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, Link's Awakening, Majora's Mask, and The Phantom Hourglass are all direct sequels that adhere to this kind of thinking. But for every third game in the series, typically, the player will always be controlling a spiritual descendant of Link inside a game set in its own unique time. A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, and The Wind Waker, again, all back up this popular belief. It could explain why there's this peculiar sense that Nintendo is occasionally rewriting its own original story, and why characters in certain sequels react and communicate like they're meeting each other for the very first time. Are you all confused yet? For several, the series would never get better than A Link to the Past. And yet, despite the huge swath of popularity that the game would come to garner, the Super Nintendo would receive only one Western Zelda game in its entire lifetime. Nintendo would still cash in on the game's popularity in the East by releasing two Zelda-based games on its Satellaview system, a popular satellite modem for the SNES co-developed by Nintendo and Bandai. The first game, entitled BS: The Legend of Zelda, was a downloadable 4-part episodic remake of the original NES title, but with a few subtle differences. First, the graphics and the music were given a colorful facelift, and a few elements of the gameplay, such as having it play out in real time and increasing the capacity of Link's rupee purse, were also given changes. It is often cited as the third quest because of the way it totally messed with the dungeons, the items, and the size ratio of the overworld itself. To cunningly boast awareness of the Satellaview, Nintendo would also opt to supplant the system's two mascots, a boy in a baseball cap and a girl with red hair, in the shoes of protagonists instead of the iconic Link. In 1997, Nintendo released a follow-up to the game, BS: The Legend of Zelda: The Sacred Stones, which, again, divided the game into 4 weekly downloadable chunks. Sacred Stones is considered to be a long side quest to A Link to the Past, owing to the look and the general feel of the game as a whole. It retained the two Satellaview mascots as before, and it would set the player on a quest to find 8 pieces of hollowed masonry and to defeat a resurrected Ganon. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of each of these Satellaview games is that, like an interactive television show, they could only be played while the game was being aired. Doing this allowed for Nintendo to broadcast hints and tips to the player while they played to help assist them on their epic quest. As well as the Satellaview, it was always Nintendo's intention to produce a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. Sony had developed the sound chip for the SNES, the SPC 700, and had experience and grounding in CD technology, and so Nintendo's looking to Sony to get the project off the ground was really a case of natural selection. However, as the legend goes, Sony was determined to break into the video game market itself and had seen an ideal opportunity to do so when that early contract with Nintendo was drawn up. During that deal, Nintendo signed an agreement that would give Sony the rights to work on a CD-based console that would run both the planned SNES CD games and also be backwards compatible with Super Nintendo carts. When Nintendo eventually released this thing, it decided to attempt to sever the ties with Sony and instead struck a deal with one of Sony's top rivals, Philips. After a brutal legal battle, Nintendo successfully found a way to pull out of the contract, eventually dropping the idea of releasing a CD component for the Super Nintendo entirely. Nintendo would give Philips use of 2 of its IPs for a series of video games for its CDI machine. Mario and Luigi would cordially appear in the puzzle game Hotel Mario, and Link and Pals would show up in 3 interactive movie games: Link, The Faces of Evil, Wand of Gamelon, released concurrently in 1999, and Zelda's Adventure, released a year later. The first 2 games, Faces of Evil and Wand of Gamelon, were side-scrolling action games in the same vein of Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, but spliced up with dated-looking cartoon sequences. For Zelda's Adventure, the original top-down approach was adopted, but the game filled its boots with poorly pre-rendered computer-generated sprites and absolutely garbage acting. Not surprisingly, given the game's prolific heritage, the Philips games were lambasted by the gaming press and fans of the series alike. Today, they stand as weird and rather curious entries, extreme oddities amongst a collection of classics.
Press button 1 to slash with the sword.
Instead of thinking of it as making a game, think of it as nurturing a miniature garden called Hyrule, Miyamoto once said about making of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Ironically, several fans of the popular series would all come to view Ocarina not as a brilliant nurturing of Hyrule, but as a brilliant nurturing of Link himself. Released in 1998 and built from a drastically modified version of the Super Mario 64 engine, Ocarina of Time chronicled the biggest shift in the series to date, the transition from a 2D to a 3D realm, in a longer period in Link's life. Starting out as a young boy, somewhere between the age of 8 and 9, we would see Link's quest lead him into adulthood. But it is quite clear what Miyamoto was hinting at here. Technically jaw-dropping draw distances, real-time light sourcing, and expansive environments that could all be covered effortlessly on Link's trusty steed, Epona, and an almost faultless camera and control system. It's true the world of Hyrule was never so brilliantly and beautifully fleshed out before this. The sequel to Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, released in 2000, introduced several firsts to the series. Originally titled Zelda Gaiden in 1999, it was the first time inside the main canon of the series that Nintendo would really break its Triforce of characters. The first game to do this was Link's Awakening on the Game Boy. Majora's Mask doesn't include any physical incarnation of Ganon at all, although his name is mentioned, and Zelda's appearance is relatively brief in relation to the prevailing games in the series. Beginning life as an intended extra section of Ocarina of Time, had the game been released on the Nintendo 64 DD as originally intended, that is, it heavily reworked the Zelda structure and messed with the series' familiar Hyrule setting. As a result, many fans viewed Majora's Mask as the most jarring game in the franchise. The graphic style used for Majora's Mask is essentially Ocarina refined, with several of the same elements spread throughout. The biggest difference between the 2 Nintendo 64 titles is that, in Majora's Mask, Link doesn't age. Although, there's a mask in the game that makes this possible, but only as a special use kind of thing, and the whole episode is set over just 3 video game days. Link's mission is to prevent the destruction of Termina, a slightly more sophisticated and brutal alternative version of Hyrule, from an ominous moon that, in 3 days' time, will destroy the entire world. With only 3 days until the game is over, it is necessary for Link to keep traveling back in time to restart the first day over again until his quest is completed. Oddly enough, despite the notion of time travel and rebirth being a strong mantra for the Zelda series as a whole, some would find it difficult to warm up to Majora's confining time travel structure and heavily oppressive tone. Seriously, this game is absolutely depressing all the way through. That being said, others consider this title to be one of the most inventive and atmospheric games in the series. It wasn't one of my favorites, that's for sure. If there were some fans that found it difficult to warm up to the direction of Majora's Mask, then the next Zelda game to come along was always destined to put a few noses completely out of joint. After the infamous Legend of Zelda Space World GameCube demo in 2000, which showed an impressively rendered sword fight between Link and Ganon, its sinewy graphical style of an adult Link had many fans believing that this was going to be a very dark Zelda adventure. However, the game that would eventually be released looked absolutely nothing like the teasing demo unveiled to Space World attendees. Taking the biggest shift in terms of visual style, the Wind Waker's cel-shaded graphics would upset several fans who were all expecting an epic and mature Zelda story. Ironically, however, perhaps the biggest shift in the game actually came from its scrapping of certain Zelda gameplay tropes. Instead of time travel, the Wind Waker uses the wind and the ocean for its puzzle and explorative elements, and rather than one large, cohesive land to explore to your heart's content, it was split into several islands that were all connected by miles and miles of boring-ass sea that Link had to traverse by sailboat. But Wind Waker also had a sense of humor to it, and it took many aspects from the portable Zelda games, with more emphasis on characters and a feeling of being more accessible for newcomers. Its effusive and simple anime-style graphics captured the facial expressions of its characters so much better than any Zelda game that had come before it, going to extreme lengths to invoke a sense of real emotion, thus establishing a real connection with Link, and very cleverly serving as subtle hints to the player to help them solve puzzles. In a bid to perhaps soften the visual blow to its fans, Nintendo would accompany the game with a bonus disc containing the original Ocarina of Time, as well as Ocarina of Time Master Quest, a much more arduous version of the N64 original that was intended to be released for the Nintendo 64 DD. The Master Quest was pretty much Dark Souls as a Zelda game. Perhaps due to its basic look, the next Zelda game to appear on the GameCube came and went with generally very little fanfare at all. Developed by Nintendo, The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventures took visual and multiplayer elements from the GBA game, A Link to the Past and Four Swords, and it brought an entirely new squad-based dynamic to the series for some reason, slotting weirdly between two Game Boy Advance games. Four Swords Adventures would form the second game of Zelda's Four Swords trilogy. It allowed 1 to 4 players if you had a link-up cable and knew at least 3 other people with a Game Boy Advance and a copy of the game, that is, to control 4 different colored links, position them into various formations, and tear off to work together to solve the game's color and teamwork-themed puzzles. The multiplayer emphasis of this thing was further bolstered by a unique battle mode that allowed 4 friends to select a Link of their own and beat the shit out of each other with their swords. The next game to appear in Nintendo's popular series was the engaging Twilight Princess, a game that famously carried the weight of 2 consoles on its shoulders. This one is my personal favorite in the entire series. After a 1-year delay, Twilight Princess would prove to be a fantastic farewell to the GameCube, but sadly a rather tepid and awkward debut for the Wii. With The Wind Waker, Nintendo's intention was to make a Zelda game that anyone could actually finish, and as a result, many fans would bemoan the game for being way too easy. So, Nintendo looked back to Ocarina as the blueprint for the style and the general direction of Twilight Princess. Running from a heavily tweaked Wind Waker engine, Twilight Princess looked to be the polar opposite to its GameCube sibling. In hindsight, it was actually a culmination of ideas and themes from the later Zelda games. It clearly borrows from Ocarina of Time in terms of its visual, and it adopted the darker, more mature and oppressive tone of Majora's Mask, and it boasts the scale and the gameplay variations of Wind Waker, with regard to its cinematic look and continued use of impressive facial animations. Somewhere down the line, during mid-development, it was decided that the graphical style of the game would be altered significantly. Early shots of the game showing Link inside a gray and desaturated world would only come to reaffirm to fans of the series that the Twilight Princess would, indeed, be a much darker direction for the series as a whole. However, the eventual graphical style would shift to a hazy world made of warm, serene palettes, but that darker direction was kept fully intact. The game also contained more dungeons and more items than the Ocarina of Time, as was the intention by Nintendo to finally offer the hardcore Zelda fan a game to really test their mettle. While the Wii version is essentially an enhanced port of the GameCube release, the game would actually play out slightly differently, too. The game worlds were mirrored to one another. Link has always been left-handed in the games from his inception, and if you were to look closely at the series, you'll notice that whatever direction Link is facing, he will hold his sword in his left hand. With the advent of the Wii remote controls in Twilight Princess, Nintendo realized that several gamers would be right-handed, and so would make Link a mirror to the player in the Wii version, and the game world would follow suit. With the exception of Link's crossbow training, a short game packed in with the Wii Zapper as a means of demonstrating the peripheral, Link would not return to the Wii for several more years still to come. In the meantime, the cartoonish Link of Wind Waker and Minish Cap continued to adventure strong on the Nintendo DS. The first of these was Phantom Hourglass, a successor to Wind Waker, which retained much of the game's seafaring action. Link's pirate gal pal, Tetra, goes missing after the duo happen upon a ghost ship, which then kicks off a quest to save the damsel and uncover the mystery of the Phantom Vessel. The biggest change was a touchscreen control method that saw players directing Link about the world and performing combat moves using the stylus. Though some players disliked the lack of traditional controls using the D-pad and buttons, Phantom Hourglass received critical acclaim and it sold well over 4.1 million copies. Given that monstrous success, it's unsurprising in the slightest to see that the Zelda series would return to the DS in 2009 with Spirit Tracks. And, once more, the stylus was the main input device. Instead of sailing around a vast, boring ocean, Link now found himself riding the rails as a train engineer with a mean sideline in actual swordplay, trying to discover why the titular spirit tracks that connected the kingdom were mysteriously disappearing. Though this might seem a little out of place in a series that has usually had a high focus on straight fantasy and not drawn too much on technological aspects, director Daikai Iwamoto was deliberately aiming for a very different feeling to a regular Zelda game. The result was another wild success, though with 2.6 million sales, it never quite matched up to its predecessor's popularity. Though Link's next game was not a new one, it did generate considerable excitement as it was a remake of the game many still consider to be the greatest in the entire series. Ocarina of Time 3D was a full visual overhaul of the N64 game for the 3DS, designed to take full advantage of the added sense of depth offered by the newer handheld hardware. The game was both a critical success and a critical triumph, selling over 1 million copies, but bigger things were coming as the Zelda series was about to return to the home console arena at last. The Wii received Skyward Sword in 2011, making it a relatively late release in the console's lifespan. And though Skyward Sword was not nearly as dark in tone as, say, Twilight Princess, it didn't veer back into the overt cartoon weirdness of the cel-shaded Wind Waker. The tone was pitched closest to that of Ocarina of Time, with a slightly more vibrant color palette. The game is also the earliest story in the entire Zelda canon chronologically, with Link and Zelda cast as childhood friends. When Zelda is kidnapped and taken down to the surface, Link becomes entangled in the evil Giraheim's plot to free the Demon King Demise, and must prevent it to save Zelda and the world. In order to add a bit of extra precision to the Wii controller's motion sensing capabilities, Skyward Sword made use of the Wii Motion Plus add-on. The more accurate tracking played heavily into the combat, with the Wii controller used for the sword itself and the shield controlled using the Wii nunchuck. Likewise, the bow was now fired by pulling the remote back as you would with a real bow, and bombs could now be rolled towards targets like bowling balls. Despite some reservations over the implementation of this new scheme, as well as a feeling that the rest of the game development community was finally beginning to catch up to the 3D Zelda mechanics, most reviewers were overwhelmingly positive about the game as a whole, and it sold millions of copies in just a short order of being released. Though the Wii was succeeded by the Wii U in late 2012, there was no early Zelda release to go with it, so GameCube remasters were released to plug in the gap. Wind Waker HD in 2013 and Twilight Princess HD in 2016. Instead, new developments would take place over on the 3DS, though they would also mine the past for inspiration. A Link Between Worlds was released in 2013, and it served as a true successor to A Link to the Past. Link's task was to prevent the theft of Hyrule's Triforce by the inhabitants of the parallel world of Lorule, who seek to restore their kingdom after it falls into disarray and ruin and decay due to the destruction of their own Triforce. One fun mechanic here was the ability to merge onto walls as a mural of sorts, which allowed Link to cross otherwise impassable gaps. This was an excellent game, and it went on to sell over 4.2 million copies. The next game to release was Majora's Mask 3D, another 3DS remake in the fashion of the previous Ocarina of Time. This one sold over 3.3 million copies, and it was easily the most exciting Zelda development during 2015, as that year's other 3D release was a rare and total misstep for the series. Triforce Heroes focused, again, on multiplayer cooperation in a similar manner to the prior Four Swords games, and it allowed players the option to play alone through local wireless or even online with others. However, the game was totally stifled by its need to cater to the friendless, with few challenges ever truly testing an organized team. Additionally, much of the design was lifted from prior Zelda games with little innovation. Likewise, the spin-off Hyrule Warriors on Wii U was little more than Dynasty Warriors games with a new Zelda skin, though it was popular enough to see a few sequels of its own. A lack of innovation is not something that troubled the most recent major game in the series. It began its life as a Wii U game and was even revealed to the public as such a thing in 2014. Breath of the Wild ended up carrying a new piece of hardware to momentous heights, as the Nintendo Switch ended up being the system that most players would use to experience it. Released in 2017, the game was a total and radical reinvention of the series, taking the game's trademark mechanics and fitting them into an open-world design that drew strongly upon influences seen in the likes of Assassin's Creed. This game saw Link awakening from a long slumber to find a world totally in ruins, having been sealed away by Zelda following a heavy defeat from Ganon. To end the tyrant's influence over Hyrule, Link's goal was to defeat the divine beasts that had been corrupted by Ganon, release the spirits of the kingdom's champions, and then slay the evil Ganon himself. Breath of the Wild was a critical success, and it is also the best-selling Zelda game to date. Tears of the Kingdom followed this, using the same style and mechanics and the same open world, but also adding brand new, fresh ideas, such as being able to build pretty much anything you want with new powers available. Tears of the Kingdom also has what I consider to be the most maniacal version of Ganondorf in the entire series. So, what is it that makes the Zelda games so popular? Why does every new chapter in the franchise create such an air of buzz and anticipation and excitement that totally surrounds it? Why do people meticulously dissect every single screenshot that's released, analyze and pore over every Zelda-related article and rumor, and await the next chapter more so than any other video game franchise in the world? Miyamoto sums this sentiment up quite nicely, I think. I think most people dream about becoming heroes, he told Superplay magazine in 2003. For me, it has always been important that the gamers grow together with Link, that there is a strong relationship between the one who holds the controller and the person on the screen. I have always tried to create the feeling that you really are in Hyrule. If you don't feel that way, then it will lose some of its magic. And that is my overview of the Zelda series in its entirety. Like I said at the beginning of this thing, The Legend of Zelda is a game that resonates with me over anything else you can find on the shelves today. The idea of being able to wield a sword and slay epic bosses and explore dark and mysterious dungeons and fulfill your prophecy as a hero is just an amazing experience I get from playing a Zelda game. The idea of being able to rescue a princess and uncover new secrets and meet new friends is completely nostalgic to me over anything else, and Zelda truly encompasses these feelings and emotions so much better than anything else. Which Zelda game is your favorite? Let me know down in the comments. Do you agree with my analysis? I have been Samantha Rose, your wild host, and I will see you all next time on